Their new car, named the Lancia Rally, is a supercharged, tubular-framed, lightweight racer designed for just one purpose. In these dry conditions and on the twisting, cambered roads of the Alps, it's utterly without equal.
I've got a bit of a soft spot for all old Lancias, but in this, it's not soft.
Looking back in my career, it was maybe the best rally in my life I have done. It was just like a dream. When I was just thinking, I want to cut this corner, don't lose 10 centimeters of road. The car was going exactly on this point and it was flowing. It was just, nobody can beat me.
There is no doubt that Lancia 037 is one of the greatest rally cars of all time, if not the greatest. Appearing for the first time in 1982, but only started racing by 1983, the 037 proved everyone wrong, with winning against the mighty Quattro. But what's the story of this car? How a two-wheel drive car managed to win against the four-wheel drive revolution. So hello guys and welcome back to another video, and here is the story of the Lancia 037. Lancia was founded in 1906 by Vincenzo Lancia in Torino, Italy. From the beginning, Lancia was very innovative, and this was what made them so special. The first car produced by Lancia was Lancia Tipo 51, which later was renamed Alpha, starting this way the use of the Greek alphabet. In 1913 came the Lancia Theta. Designed by Vincenzo himself, Theta was the first European car with a full electric system, with a starter motor, electric lights and a lighting dashboard. This came at a time when most of the cars came with a crank starter. In 1922, Lancia introduced the Lambada. The Lambada was the first car with a monocoque chassis, independent from suspension and the first to use a V4 engine. Lambadas were quite popular cars among private racers, which used the cars in different European events. In 1933 came the Augusta, which adopted the same principles as the Lambada, but in a smaller package and a more affordable price. In 1937 came the Aprilia. The Aprilia is the first car which was designed with a wind tunnel, something that everyone followed soon. The Lancia Aprilia is the last car designed by Vincenzo Lancia, since he passed away before the car made it into production, in February 15, 1937. After the death of Vincenzo, his wife Adele and his son Gianni took over the company. With the beginning of the Second World War, the car production stopped, and all the factories were being used for the army. After the war, Gianni decided to go in a quite different direction compared to his father. He brought Vittorio Iano from Alfa Romeo, which immediately started working on the Aurelia. Aurelia became the first car to use a V6 engine. Originally, Aurelia came as a sedan, but Pininfarina and other coach builders presented coupes and convertible. Differently from his father, Gianni loved racing and saw a great potential on it. In 1954 came the D50, which quickly became a successful F1 car. But the death of Alberto Ascari and the financial problems of the time made Gianni to withdraw from the racing scene. In 1956 came the Flaminia, which replaced the Aurelia. The car was meant to be the top-of-the-line Lancia, and was available as a sedan, as a coupe and a convertible. In 1961 came Flavia, another great Lancia. Like the previous cars, the car was available with different body styles, which were designed by different coach builders, including here Zagato. In 1963 came the Fulvia. Fulvia is an important car for Lancia, because it was the first official rallying car of Scuderia Lancia. Fulvia won 7 Italian rallying championships and the 1972 International Championship. In 1969 came the end of an era for Lancia. Being over-engineered cars, Lancias were very expensive, something that led to big financial troubles. In 1969 Fiat made a bid, and so they took over Lancia. This would be a new era for Lancia, where everything would change, some for good and some for bad. Fiat started changing things immediately. They wanted to change the figure of Lancia. The racing division of Lancia was asked how they would describe the rally car of the future, and all came into an agreement that a mid-engine two-seater more like a racing car would be the best choice. Coincidentally, around the same time, at the 1970 Torino Motor Show, Bertone presented a mid-engine sport car, which they called it Stratos Zero. Cesare Fiorio, Lancia's competition manager, and Piero Gobato, the managing director of Lancia, saw their future rally car on the Stratos Zero. But there was a lot of work to do before making the Stratos available for rallying. Lancia requested Marcello Gadini at Bertone to design a more practical version of his crazy design. Also, the team had to find an engine for Stratos, since Lancia had no engine on her lineup for such car. After taking into consideration an Abarth straight 4 engine and a Maserati V8, Lancia's team managed to convince Enzo Ferrari to let them to use the 2.4-liter V6 engine of the Dino. This was mostly achieved thanks to the fact that both brands were under the Fiat umbrella. After 3 years of development, Stratos HF was ready for the 1974 World Rally Championship. Lancia also had to build 400 road-going Stratos. This was a first for a rally car, and something that would lead to the creation of Group B in 1982. Stratos was just perfect, and had no competition at all, winning the 1974, 75 and 76 World Rally Championships. Decided to retire Stratos after the 1976 season. There were multiple reasons for this decision, but the main one were some rule changes that happened in 1976, and that Fiat wanted to use a car from their production lineup, a car that people could associate with. Enter the 131 Abarth. Fiat was doing great with the 124 Abarth. The Pininfarina designed Roadster had placed second in 1973, 74 and 75. but by 1975 the 124 Spider had reached its limits with its 16-valve engine. Fiat started looking for something else. Originally they were thinking for a special X1-9, but they decided to go with a newly introduced 131 instead. Developed by Abarth, the 131 Rally was powered by a 2-liter 16-valve engine with around 230 horsepower. The 131 was meant to be the replacement of Stratos, and what a replacement it was. The 131 managed to win the 1977, 78 and 1980 World Championship, and like its predecessor, different championships around Europe. While the 131 was still being a competitive car, the big news came on summer 1979. FISA announced they would change the rules. Now there would be 3 groups that would cover rallying: Group A, Group B and Group N. Makers could use special cars for Group A, but they had to build 5,000 homologation cars, while Group N was for standard cars, which hadn't received special parts. But the big news was the Group B. Those few rules that were announced stated that makers could build just 200 cars. Some makers protested these rules, while others, like Lancia, supported these new regulations. The Group B would take place in 1982, so the teams had something less than 3 years to build the Group B cars. In 1979, Abarth had started working on a new project, named SC035. The 035 was a 131 with a Lamberti 2-liter twin-cam rally engine, packed with a Ferrari supercharger. Fiat and Abarth did some tests with the 035, including here a 1,000 kilometers test run. The car proved to be very reliable, but the performance numbers were very disappointing, so the project was cancelled. Fiat and Lancia started looking for other possibilities. One of the first proposals was the SC036. Like Stratos, would be built from scratch, and like Stratos, the 036 would be powered by a Ferrari engine, this time a 3-liter V8 from a 308. But the project was cancelled in the first steps, since the project would be too expensive and the car would be very heavy for rallying. Another proposal was a Beta Monte Carlo with a transverse 4-cylinder engine, in a similar style with a production car. The biggest problem with this idea was that the car needed a new gearbox, and there was no time for such a thing. A solution was to turn the engine longitudinally, but a new front and rear subframes would be needed. Meanwhile, Renault had presented their Group B car, the MED 5 Turbo. The car presented a new idea. Renault had removed the engine from the front and had replaced it with a better turbocharged engine, which was placed behind the rear seats. Inspired from this idea, Fiat's and Lancia's engineers started working. The idea was to use a Fiat Ritmo or a Lancia Delta and to mount a supercharged Fiat 131 Abarth engine behind the rear seats. But this idea came with some problems. The first was the accessibility to the parts. The other was the weight. FISA rules stated that the weight of the car depended on the engine capacity, and Fiat and Lancia felt they couldn't reach satisfying numbers. The final idea was to build a front-engine supercharged car, but this was dismissed from the beginning, since the car would be too heavy. In the end, Fiat, Abarth and Lancia engineers decided to go with the two proposals: the Beta Monte Carlo based car and the mid-engine Ritmo or Delta mid-engine car. Meanwhile, in Germany, Audi was doing progress with the Quattro project. With the new FISA rules, the four-wheel drives were allowed to be part of the WRC. Everyone knew that the four-wheel drive was the way to go, including here Lancia. But there was no time for a four-wheel drive Lancia, so the car that would be presented in 1982 when the Group B rules would take place was meant to be a permanent car, while Lancia would develop their four-wheel drive car, the Delta S4. Finally, in May 1980, the decision was made. The Monte Carlo-based car was the way to go, and the project was named SC037. The work began to design the new car. Since the car was planned to be based on the Monte Carlo, Lancia had to change only the front and the rear subframes. By April, the first sketches were done, and by July, the first mock-up was completed. Meanwhile, Sergio had made the decision to build the 200-rod cars. This decision was made before FISA had announced any rules or limits of how many homologation cars had to be built. The delay of FISA on announcing the rules played a big part of the legend that Group B had no rules, since some of the biggest teams, Lancia, Audi, Renault, Peugeot, had started building their cars before the rules were announced. Meanwhile, the development of the car continued back in Corso Marche. In summer 1980, Monte Carlo was fitted with a supercharged Abarth 131 engine, and a number of tests were done with it. By September, Dallara had completed the first chassis, but while Lancia and the others were developing their cars, FISA continued to create confusion with those few rules that they were announcing. They stated that Group A would be for 4-seaters, and a minimum of 5,000 homologation cars had to be built, while Group B would be for 2-seaters, with a minimum of 200 cars. But the part that confused everybody was that FISA basically banned Group B cars even before the championship started. They stated that Group B cars could not race on a world or European championship. This decision frustrated everyone. Many teams had started developing their Group B cars and had spent lots of money, so they started demanding new rules. Most of the teams saw Group B as the way to go, since they only had to build 200 cars. But drivers also wanted Group B, since it was the one that looked the most appealing. The 5 Turbo had started participating in different rallying events, so everyone was amazed by it. The rule that didn't allow the Group B cars to participate in European and World Championship was repealed later. But again, teams continued to raise their voice against FISA for the lack of transparency. Meanwhile, back in Torino, tests continued. Thus, the supercharged Monte Carlo was entered at that year's Giro d'Italia. The car was driven by Attilio Bettega and Michele Alberto. Giro d'Italia consisted of 6 days of rallying and racing on different surfaces. Despite some minor problems, which had more to do with the fact that the car was a regular Monte Carlo and this was the first time with this engine configuration, the supercharged Monte Carlo placed second overall, right behind the turbocharged Monte Carlo. The Lancia Abarth team was impressed by these results, and the supercharger was the way to go. Until then had been a big debate if they should use turbos or superchargers. Both had their advantage, but in the end the supercharger won. In 1980, Abarth and Lancia started doing the first test runs with a 001 chassis. These tests didn't end well, since the car had problems with a Kugellicher fuel injection and the supercharger. Meanwhile, the car was sent to Pininfarina for aerodynamic tests, and the results were pretty bad. The main problem found by Pininfarina was the rear part of the car, which had to be redesigned. Pininfarina suggested a tighter body, instead of the ultra-wide rear end that the test car had. Also, another big change was that the air vents were moved behind the rear windows. The body was made out of fiberglass and was made out of 3 pieces: the Monte Carlo cockpit and the front and the rear parts, which were removable for super easy access. Lancia Abarth chose the Spider Monte Carlo cockpit, so they could mount a fiberglass roof with two bubbles, Zagato style. Also, the roof was fitted with some small air vents for better ventilation, which proved to be very effective. Meanwhile, the team had to build two more cars, number 002 and 003. The latter one was built for Stradale testing. But while Pininfarina was designing the Stradale 037, Lancia Abarth was continuing the test with the 001, back in Campovolo. At this point, the team started testing the rear spoiler on the car. Originally, the spoiler looked like the 288 Evoluzione, but later became more similar with the ducktail spoiler that we are so familiar today. In April 24, 1981, the first crash test was done, and the car scored pretty well. Also, some tests were done with a 1750cc engine, both with natural aspiration and turbocharge. But the supercharger was way more superior. In the end, the 037 had a 1995cc engine. The block of the engine was a 4-cylinder, which was used on the Lancia Beta, and had a bore of 84mm and a stroke of 90mm. The piston heads came from a 131 Abarth, while the most of the other parts came from other Fiat products. The supercharger was the Abarth R10 type rotors. Originally, the 037 was planned to use a Ferrari supercharger, but the Abarth one proved to be way more effective. The gearbox of choice was a ZF 5D S25, which was a 5-speed manual. The gearbox had proven to be very good and a reliable gearbox, since Maserati Bora, Di Tommaso Pantera and BMW M1 came with this gearbox. In July 1981, FISA made the final Group B announcement, when they stated that the 200 homologation cars had to be exact replicas of competition cars. Also, FISA announced that the weight and the wheel size depended on the engine size. Just by chance, the 037 complied with all these rules. The Lancia Abarth team had played of everything they had, and definitely everything was worth it. Meanwhile, back in Torino, Lancia was doing lots of tests with all the 4 cars that were built, from wheels and winter tire tests to more turbo tests. All the cars were busy. While the team continued the test, the 200 bodies of the Stradale 037s were built and were sent in a magazine in Torino. In fall 1981, Lancia finished the first pre-production Stradale, number 006. In November, Pininfarina presented the final design of the car, which included a more refined front end and a quite different rear end, with the most notable part being the rectangular rear lights, while the original design had 4 cycle rear lights. And in November 1981, the 037 made its first appearance for the eye of the public, where pictures of it were published on the Autosport magazine. The car was officially badged as Lancia. Until then, the test cars ran with Abarth logos. But due to the rally history of Lancia, plus the fact that Fiat had no intention of reviving Abarth as a separate brand, the decision was made to badge the car as Lancia. But there was no official name for it. The car was just called Lancia Rally. No announcement was made about the power of the car or about the specification of the car. But Lancia announced that the factory team would be backed by Martini. Lancia had already worked with Martini, with their Monte Carlo turbos. The final unveil of the car would take place in early 1982, before the starting of the championship. In December 1981, Lancia held a press conference at La Madria, Fiat's test track, when they unveiled the Martini painted 037. Together with the 037, were the LC1 and the Beta Monte Carlo Turbo, which were also backed by Martini. Together with car, Lancia finally announced the specs of the 037. The power output would be at something between 280 and 310 horsepower, depending on the rally setup. The body was made out of fiberglass, so the car weighed at only 960 kilos, almost the minimum for her engine size. Meanwhile, Pininfarina had completed the final design of the homologation 037, and by 1982 the work had begun to build the 200 homologation cars. Pininfarina received the front and the rear subframes and welded them together, and later painted them. After this step, the bodies were sent to Abarth, when the cars received the mechanical parts. This process was a bit time-consuming, something that increased the price of the car. A Stradale 037 started at something around $85,000 with today's money, but if you wanted a rally-prepared car, you had to pay an extra $25,000. The rally version basically gave you less luxury stuff and some special performance parts. Lancia had to build all the 200 cars by April 1st, which was the final date given by FISA. By March, all the cars were built. Lancia tried to add pop-up headlights and a rear spoiler. They decided not to go with the pop-up headlights due to reliability issues, while the spoiler delayed the approval date of FISA, since not all the cars were fitted with it, but everything was ready before April 1st. Meanwhile, the team drivers Marco Allen, Attilio Bettega and Artico Vudafieri were doing the final test runs with cars, and all of them stated that they were very satisfied with car. The new Group B would finally start in April 1st, 1982 for Lancia. Despite having a good car, this was planned to be a testing year for Lancia. They wanted to see how their car would perform, and if they could fix anything with the first evolution of the car. The FISA rules stated that the teams had to build an extra 10%, in this case 20 homologation specials, if they wanted to do any modification to the car. This rule left plenty of room for the teams to improve their cars. First stage of the 1982 European Championship for Lancia was the Costa Smeralda in Sardinia. Lancia was doing lots of test runs with the cars until the last day, in order to make a good debut. Now there was no big news about the rival cars. Audi with Quattro, Fiat with a 131 Abarth, Opel with a Ascona 400, Citroën with a Visa Trophy, Talbot with a Subbeam Lotus, and Ferrari with a 308 GTB. Overall, not a bad lineup, but no way near to the beast that came after the 1983 season. Lancia had decided to play safe. In the end, this was just a testing year. They only entered two cars, which were driven by Marco Allen and Attilio Bettega. Both cars were performing quite good. In fact, Allen managed to set the fastest stage time. But both cars had to retire due to some gearbox failures. Something that's worth mentioning is that, like the homologation cars, the 1992 037 had carburetors on the and engines were barely making 250 horsepower, plus the cars were quite heavy, weighing at over 1100 kilos. Lancia had the ends tied up, and they couldn't do nothing until the first homologation. The 1982 Costa Smeralda was won by the only Audi that entered the race. After it came a Stratos and a 131 Abarth. Next stage was in Corsica, this time for the World Championship. Lancia was feeling quite confident for this stage. since the Corsica rally was completely on tarmac roads. But despite this, they showed up with only 2 037s, again with Allen and Bettega. This time there was more competition, since beside the previous cars, a group of 911s and 5 turbos were part of the race. Once again, both cars were performing quite good, especially Bettega. The Italian was doing great with staying for a good part of the race on the 3rd place, behind a 5 turbo and a 308 GTP. But in the last minutes he crashed the car and was badly damaged, losing this way the opportunity to collect some points. Meanwhile, Allen finished the race in the 9th place. This result was affected by a small incident when he damaged his car. Because of the accident, Attilio Bettega could not continue the rest of the championship, so he was replaced by Adartico Vudafieri. The 037 proved to be a great car, at least on tarmac roads. The next race would be a real challenge for Lancia. The Acropolis Rally was one of the toughest stages of the World Championship. Finishing the race was quite an achievement, let alone winning it. For weeks, Lancia was doing tests in Greece, in order to get the 037 ready for the stage. Again, 2 cars entered the race, Allen and Vudafieri. The 037 had something around 250 horsepower and had a higher ground clearance compared to the previous cars. The Acropolis grid, besides the usual WRC cars, also featured a number of other cars, especially Japanese cars, like Nissan Violet and Skyline, Toyota Celica and Starlet, Datsun 160J, Mitsubishi Lancer and Subaru 1800. Japanese cars were very popular on rough stages, like Acropolis and Safari, when they always placed quite well.
Hope you know I take in here in good result. Winning or top 3, that's a minimum I want here. But you know in Greece this year is very, very rough rally and you never know. But I hope I take in good result here. That's important.
So you're not going to go flat out for a win then?
No, it's difficult. You know, in here you go in flat out in that's gravel and road is so rough this year. You know, in heavy rain here in winter time and now it's very, very flat in road. I never see in Greece in rough road like in this year. I never see.
Like with the previous 2 races, this also started quite good for Lancia. Both Allen and Vudafieri were scoring good times. But Vudafieri started having problems after he crashed his 037 with one of the fence cars, and soon he retired after his supercharger failed. Meanwhile, Allen was leading the rally, but problems almost struck his car. First, he started having problems with a gearbox, and later, a cracked chassis made him to leave the race. The soon-to-be Lancia drivers Henry Toivonen and Walter Rolf placed 3rd and 2nd respectively with their Ascona 400s. The rally was won by Michelle Mouton with her Quattro. This was the only Quattro out of 5 which managed to finish the race. Even though Lancia did not finish the race, they were quite pleased with the cars, because they thought that they could place higher if they fixed some problems with the first Evo and if they entered more cars. Meanwhile, Lancia was doing great progress with the Evo 1. Lancia had planned to introduce the car at the Rally of 1000 Lakes in Finland. They had more than 2 months to get the car ready, since they decided not to go in New Zealand and Brazil. But while Sergio and his team were preparing the Evo 1, different 037s were racing all over Europe on the European and Italian Championship. Like with the World Championship, Lancia wasn't doing that great on Italy or Europe. The biggest problem still was the reliability. The cars consistently would break down, and they would withdraw from the race. This happened on the Rally Internazionale della Lana, the Ypres 24 Hours, and the Rally of Vesime. But there also were times when the 037 managed to get points, like the Rally di Quattro Regioni, when Andrea Zanussi finished on the 4th place, after 3 Opel Ascona 400. Another good performance by Lancia came at the Rally di Chico e Valle del Sericcio, when 3 of 37 entered the race, and all 3 finished the race, with Adartico Vudafieri taking the 3rd place, after Ascona 400 and a 308 GTB. Meanwhile, the development of the Evo 1 was coming to its end. The homologation cars had to be ready before August 1st, which was the deadline set by FISA. The first evolution had Kugelhüpfer mechanical fuel injection, instead of the Weber carburetors, a bigger supercharger and a new crankshaft. Also, Lancia had used composite materials for body panels in order to save as much weight as possible. After a lot of hard work, the Evo 1 was finally ready for the Rally Vinho da Madeira. Lancia decided to play safe, not only because this was the first race for the Evo, but also because they were going to Finland for the 1000 Lakes Rally, which was much more important. The car was driven by Andrea Zanussi, which couldn't finish the race due to an engine failure. But the new improvements really worked out, since Zanussi was leading the rally until his car broke down. On August 27, Lancia was in Finland for the 1000 Lakes Rally. The 1000 Lakes Rally was another tough stage on WRC, so finishing the race here would be an improvement for the team. Lancia entered only one car, which was trusted to Marco Allen, which was at his home here. The 1000 Lakes Rally was mostly gravel, but despite this was one of the fastest rallies on the calendar, but was also one of the hardest one. This thanks to the jumps, which covered most of the stage. So, Marcus of 37 had 310 horsepower for the high speeds and harder springs for the jumps. But again, looked like the of-37 wasn't ready, since mechanical problems struck again. Marco was doing a great job with keeping the car on the top 3 position, despite the fact that the car had high oil and water temperatures. But he had to retire with a problem caused by the water injection system, which was used for the first time on the of-37. In the end, the race was won by Hannu Mikkola with a Quattro, and right behind him placed Stig Blomqvist with another Quattro and Pentti Aricola. But while the of-37 wasn't achieving great results, didn't mean that the car wasn't good, and Walter Roth knew that. In September, the German arrived in Torino when he started testing the car, and he was amazed by the of-37. Roth had only raced for Opel and Fiat, and for a short time for Porsche, and jumping from rally-tuned road cars to rally-built cars was a big move. He stated that the of-37 was more like a race car than a rally car, with easy drive and high speeds. The next race was the Tour de France Rally, which was one of the longest on the World Championship. Lancia entered 2 cars on the race, one driven by Vudafieri and the second by the French Jean Clair. Again, the race started good for both drivers, which were near the top places. But both Vudafieri and Clair started having problems with distributor drive, and this cost a big time to them. But in the end, Clair managed to finish the race on the 3rd place, behind Jean Ferrier, which drove a 5 Turbo, and Jean Andriot, which led most of the rally with his Ferrari 308. Vudafieri finished on 12th position, this mostly because some weather problems. Both cars were Evo 1, which meant that the changes that were made were actually working. After France came Italy, with the Sanremo Rally. Held in the city with the same name, in the region of Liguria, near the French border, the Sanremo Rally always had been a big deal for Fiat and Lancia, which always had showed up with a big number of cars. Despite being just a testing year, 4 of 37 entered the rally, which was the biggest number until then. 2 of these cars were factory team cars, driven by Marco Allen and Fabrizio Tabato, while the other 2 were private cars. First was Fulvio Baccheli, which was racing for Giuseppe Volta, and the other was Cesare Bracco, which had entered with his private car. But that year Sanremo Rally was meant to be a disaster from the beginning. Not soon after the race started, 3 out of 4 cars were out. This thanks to a number of small incidents that happened when the race started. The 1982 Sanremo Rally was one of the first rallies to show the legendary groupie crowds. Not only the officials were having trouble putting the crowds under control, but drivers were having big problems with driving the cars in full speed. Actually, there were reports of spectators getting hit by cars. But this was nothing compared to what would come in the future. The only driver left was Marco Allen, which was doing a great job with keeping the car in the top position, and for a good time keeping the second place. The Sanremo Rally was part gravel, part tarmac, so the 037 was showing its true potential. But when the end of the race was coming, the engine threw rod, and Allen had to retire. In the end, 2 Quattros took the first and second place, with Stig Blomqvist and Hannu Mikkola respectively, and Lancia's future driver Walter Roth took the third place, with his Ascona 400. If it wouldn't have been for the start problems, the race might have ended up completely differently. After the Italian rally came one of the toughest rallies on the World Championship. The Rally of Côte d'Ivoire would take place from October 27 to November 1st, in the town of Abidjan. Like the Safari Rally, the Côte d'Ivoire Rally was extremely tough, and finishing would be a score for any team. Good example of how tough this rally was is the 1972 rally, when 45 cars started and none finished. This would be an important stage for Lancia, since this was their last chance to test the 037 on the African conditions, since they skipped the Safari Rally. The 037 was prepared in typical African setup, with bull bars, hold lights, spare tires on top, and the car had a higher ground clearance. Only one car was entered, which was trusted to the hands of Adartico Budafieri, but like Lancia had suspected, they didn't finish the rally, since they had to retire due to an engine failure. Only 6 cars out of 45 finished, with Walter Roth taking the first place with his Ascona 400 and 2 Celica 2000 GTs placing behind him. The weird thing was that the 4th place was taken by a Renault 5 Turbo, while none of the Quattros managed to finish the race. After Côte d'Ivoire, Lancia turned back to Italy for the Rally di San Marino, which was part of the European Championship. Lancia entered 2 cars, one for Fabrizio Tabaton and the other for Tonino Tognana. Tonino was fighting for Drivers' Championship. Tonino had driven a 308 for most of the championship, but he decided to switch to the 037 for the last 2 races. And actually was worth it, since he won the San Marino Rally, while Tabaton had to retire due to some gearbox problems. After the San Marino, the team had to prepare for the Lombard RAC Rally. The Great Britain Rally was another tough and unique rally. The weather was a big problem here, since most of the stages would be very muddy, and in this case, the Quattro system was a big help. Also, most of the stages ran through forest, which made the race a bit more dangerous. Lancia had done tests for days in Wales, since this was the last rally of the World Championship, before the things would get serious. Lancia entered only one car, which was trusted to the hands of Marco Allen. The Finnish driver had quite a big problem ahead, since Audi had entered 7 Quattros in this race, plus the Ascona 400s and the Celica 2000 GTs always performed well on rallies like this. Lancia started having problems from the first day, since the heavy rain made things very hard for them, while the Quattros were basically flying. But by the second stage, on Sunday, Allen managed to lead the race, but he found himself on the 3rd place by night, due to some engine problems. Because of these engine problems, Allen also lost the third place, which was taken by the rising star Henri Toivonen, while the first and the second place went to Hannu Mikkola and Michel Mouton respectively. Lancia was very happy with this placing, or fourth place on a rally like the not bad at all, but this would play no impact on the 1983 season, since Lancia didn't show up, since they had already won the championship. The last race of the 1982 season was part of the European Championship. Rally d'Aosta would take place from December 10 until 12 on the city d'Aosta near the Swiss border. This rally would be very important for Lancia, not only because they entered 4 cars the third time that year after Chico and Sanremo, but also because they managed to dominate the entire race. Fabrizio Tabaton managed to take the first place, Tonino Tognana the third, Remo Celestia the fourth, and Sergio Barbera the 8th, while on the second place was Nicola Buscemi with his 308. Tonino Tognana managed to win the Drivers' Championship. He only raced 2 times with Lancia, and all the other races where he competed with his 308. With Valle d'Aosta rally came the end of the 1982 season. The results weren't the best, but the lessons learned from this season would help Lancia a lot on winning the World Championship, the European Championship and the Italian Championship in 1983. Also, drivers, teams and sponsors were lining up to take a piece of the All-37, and a crazy and amazing season was waiting ahead. So guys, thank you for watching. See you next time for the third part of the Lancia All-37 story.